How do you mitigate your risk? Montel's forecasting services cover risks from hours ahead to years ahead. We welcome you to hedge your market exposure with our diverse forecasting portfolio. Contact us at sales@montelnews.com for more info and a free trial.
Hello listeners, and welcome to the Montel Weekly Podcast. Bring you energy matters in an informal setting. This week's show returns to the fastest growing and cheapest energy source out there, solar power. And joining me today are the CEOs of two of the Nordic region's prominent solar firms, who I hope will explain the promise of the technology in a part of Europe not known for its sunny weather. So a very warm welcome to you, Andreas Thorsheim of Otovo, and to you, Harald Overholm of Alight Energy.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard, for having us.
How are you guys doing in these challenging times, and how's business amid these COVID-19 pandemic? Harald, could I start with you?
Yeah, thanks. Well, that's a good question for anyone these days. COVID has been a disruption, of course. Luckily, I would say we've been on the production side in terms of building solar. We haven't had any significant disruptions. We were able to complete the largest solar park in Sweden actually during the COVID crisis during May and June last year. So this far, the supply chain of solar has been holding up very well. On the customer side, I mean, we as a company, we work almost exclusively with commercial and industrial customers. And I think it's a dual story, right? Because short term, they've been disrupted. So, of course, business has been a little bit more difficult than you would have wished. But somewhat long term, and I think many others than us are experiencing this, that the COVID disruption has kind of triggered an almost stronger commitment to sustainability and to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And I mean, I'm not sure I fully understand the connection, but it's there. And just look at the EU COVID recovery package, which is very green. And I think that's happening on a corporate level. It's happening on a regulatory level. So somewhat unexpectedly, COVID has meant a stronger demand for solar.
So, I mean, in a sense, perhaps a clean break with the dirty fossil fuel of the past, maybe in a new beginning. Andreas, could I ask you as well? How are you coping, and how is business in this Corona time?
So we're addressing the residential market, and for us, the Corona situation kind of rippled through the supply chain, starting in Q1 with lockdowns in China affecting panel production and later panel shipments to Europe. In Q2, we had lockdowns in Europe, which affected demand adversely. People, refraining from maybe the larger capex decisions in their lives, postponing them to later, and that affected installations in Q3, which is the quarter where you install what you sold in Q2. So this kind of rippled through. But at the other end of that, I think what Harald said resonates with me. We're seeing the same thing. Consumers coming out with a bit of a leapfrog. I guess Corona is a decade happening in a year, and a lot more motivation to go green, to buy stuff online, which is beneficial for Otovo. We sell our solar panels online, and for us entering also Poland at the end of the year and Spain at the beginning of the year, our growth comes kind of after the worst COVID effects, and very optimistic about the year we have ahead of us.
We'll come back to that as well, the plans and for growth and expansion and the outlook for 2021. But I mean, as I sort of hinted in the introduction, sort of solar in the Nordic region. What's the big deal here, Andreas?
For us, it was a great school, right? It's a region, as you said, not known for being the sunniest on the planet, although a lot better than people think. High labor costs and quite low electricity prices. So it trains you to be efficient, to be automized, to be highly digital. And it was in the Nordics that we learned to play our game, and we're exporting that knowledge and being, we're cost leaders in France and Spain and Poland, and now later in the year Italy. So I think if you go to rough school, you become a pretty tough kid. Right?
Absolutely. What's your feeling in here, Harald? I mean, you're in a different sector from Otovo, but you're in the commercial and industrial side. How does that work? Solar in Sweden. or in the Nordics, or even pan-European, but specifically solar in the Nordic region?
Yeah, I mean, I really like Andreas' point of view here, that if you can make it here, you can make it anywhere, right? It's the darkest place in Europe. And also, much like Andreas and Otovo, Alight, which I'm the founder of, we're expanding rapidly across Europe. So we're certainly not focused on being a Swedish solar company. But I mean, that said, I also want to just take a step back and say, look, I mean, when solar works, it works. And it does two things. The one thing is that it generates value for customers. And we've been able to make sure that solar does indeed generate value for customers in Sweden. And that's why they buy it. So, you reach that point, it generates value, then that's it. Secondly, I think we're all purpose-driven and we come into the sector because we believe in it. So we want to see the environmental impact happening. And that too, I think that's a little bit actually talking about Sweden, a little bit of a pet theme of mine is that you often hear that Sweden has 100% clean and renewable electricity supply, which is of course true, but Sweden also has an immense amount of export and import with its surrounding countries, notably Poland, Germany, and Lithuania. So there was this report 2 years ago from something called NEP, which is just this really broad coalition of universities and the energy industry. And they actually came to the conclusion that if we build out clean power production in Sweden, we could export up to 60 terawatt hours per year to these very dirty countries. Poland is like, there was this chart in The Economist actually last week saying that Poland is the one country in the EU that you can see the borders from space because the amount of coal that they burn. And we export directly into Poland from SE4, which is the most southern region where we typically would put the solar. And the conclusion was that by doing this, we could offset about 60 million tons of CO2, which is coincidentally the entire CO2 debt of Sweden. So we could, just by exporting clean power, make Sweden basically carbon neutral. So I think that's a little bit of a forgotten story sometimes when we get very narrow and just think within our borders. Power is a transnational system, and it's a system perspective that you need to see that impact.
I think also a lot of the sort of this solar is too costly or isn't profitable in region X. That's always information with a due date, right? With the incredible reduction in solar energy prices that happens every single month, right? Keep in mind, the cost of this product is coming down 1% per month, right? So a lot of that news is yesterday's news. Basically, the question is, when or by how much do you beat the grid prices? And I think the hypothesis when we started Otovo was that, well, with this drop in prices, solar energy is going to win everywhere. And that hypothesis number one. And I think that's coming increasingly true. And second, the hardware price is going to matter less and less because it's asymptotically going towards zero. So it's all the other stuff that you need to be good at. The financing, the marketing, the last mile logistics, these things. And I think that's why I think Scandinavian countries can be leaders coming out of this decade, because we experience the ratio of non-hardware to the rest being high first, right? Because we have more expensive labor at the outset. So I think that's what drives now Nordic companies to be at the forefront of where solar is going in the next decade.
Currently, the Nordic region is experiencing very cold weather, so power prices are high at the moment. But if we look back at 2019, 2020, they've actually been very low. I mean, how can your offering compare with the retail market as it currently stands, Andreas?
Obviously, with a dynamic market like in Scandinavia, there will be ups and downs. And I think the long-term trend is that power prices to consumer have been increasing over the last decade, right? And keep in mind that we're selling energy that's behind the meter, which is a lot more stable than the wholesale prices, and in general the most valuable power you can have, right? Because it's produced and possibly stored at the point of consumption, and so that power is a lot more valuable. It contains the wholesale price, the grid price, the tariffs, and the VAT if that gets added. So that's a lot more stable and a higher number. And we're seeing in most European countries, the price we're competing against is high and flat or high and increasing. So I think this leaves us room to beat the grid price ever more every year.
Does it help? I know that in Norway, potentially also coming in Sweden, Harald, but in Norway there's a very strong grassroots or anti-wind feeling. Does that benefit Otovo that you're not wind, you're a renewable form of energy that is solar instead?
I like wind power. Just have to say that first. I hope we can build out all the renewable energy we can, both at sea and on land. That being said, I like also conflict-free energy. We need to transition so much fossil fuel activity that we need, to find energy forms that can create good compromises and with a minimum of conflict. And when we build out the distributed solar, it happens often in industrial areas, on rooftops, on commercial buildings, or in our case, on houses and garages and barns that already exist in the landscape, and that's popular to people. We had this poll before Christmas where solar energy came out as the most popular to have in your backyard, and I think that's indicative of one of the strengths of solar. It's easy, it's fast, it gets built out without protests, and that's one of its strengths for the decade to come.
So maybe it's a WIMBY, a welcome in my backyard type of energy source. Harald, if I can then ask you, I mean, how do you see the wholesale market impact and how you can compare it with power prices that exist in the market for commercial and industrial sectors?
Very good question. And first of all, just to summarize it, let me say that we always have a positive NPV for the customers buying our product. So, I mean, the product in our case is a power purchase agreement. It's a long-term power contract that makes sure that the customer is buying the contract from a new solar asset. And they always have a positive NPV. So we're not selling this on the back of any particular environmental premium. The environmental driver is there and it's important to customers, but it has to be a positive NPV. I think it's just generally accepted. So, but the question is, how do we get that? How do we get to that positive net present value? And maybe the Montel pod is a good place to be a little bit more specific about power prices, because in most cases I would just say, look, it works. You don't have to worry about it. But let me actually take just a brief moment and go into the details, because I think it's a widely misunderstood topic. And you, of course, know that when we see the average power price being printed in a newspaper or whatever, it is indeed the average of a lot of different dimensions. When you're a commercial or industrial customer buying solar, I mean, first of all, the price zone matters a lot, right? So you do solar in Sweden in the two southern zones, which is SE3 and SE4. And they obviously have, significantly higher prices than SE1 and SE2 because of the trouble of getting all of that wind power from SE1 and SE2 down to the south. That would be the first thing to think of. The other thing is that what we call the capture rate, which is the intraday volatility of prices, is very good for solar. And now solar is the capture. I mean, the production curve of solar is pretty given. We always produce the most in the middle of the day. And in SE4, for example, you have these very significant power shortages in the middle of the day, in the middle of the summer. I mean, this summer we saw something like, I think it topped out at like 100 euros per megawatt hour in the middle of the day in SE4. And that's amazing for a customer with a PPA with solar, because any large scale PPA today would be 30 euros per megawatt hour or lower. That delta is just amazing. I mean, we're not only saving money, we're talking making significant amounts of money. So I guess when you break down to the story to that level of granularity, you see a different story, which is that the volatility is increasing. During the summer month, you have the peaks in the middle of the day, and that's exactly what solar is addressing. So, yeah, I mean, it's a good story.
What about sort of demand growth in the region? We talk a lot about, demand has been falling in the Nordic region, both in Norway, Sweden, but there is talk of the electrification of heating and transport, of which, you guys are a part of, in a sense. I mean, what's your view of demand in the region, Harald?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. So electrification is happening. It's a long-term trend across the globe. It's a long-term trend in Sweden in many different ways. And it's coupled, especially in these very mature markets, it's coupled with another trend, which is the retiring old fleet of centralized assets and of the grid. So you have these two macro factors that just make sure that there's going to be a power gap coming up in the future. But that's maybe the long term. But even when we look at this summer, there was power shortage in SE4 in the middle of the day, just people using too much power and too little power being produced. So I think we're seeing that here and now. And Sweden is not that large of a power market. We don't have that many centralized power producing assets. If one of them gets switched off, as you had these unscheduled interruptions with nuclear this summer, suddenly you have a power shortage. That's actually true here and now, and it doesn't matter how many EVs we add to that equation. It's actually true in this moment. So I think this is something where distributed assets like solar that you build out incrementally, organically, the whole time, it's great. I mean, it's obviously addressing an urgent need here and now, and that need is only going to grow.
Absolutely. What's your view, Andreas, on demand in the region and Norway in particular?
Yeah, I think it's going to be super, super strong. Our estimates of Europe as a whole is that by 2025, we'll be installing residential solar power on the continent, not just Otovo, but all players, for a yearly value of 9 billion euros, right? So it's enormous. And you can see countries like Poland, which most people think of like an entirely coal-powered country. They did about 200,000 residential installations last year. They're the number one country in Europe. No one saw that coming 2 or 3 years ago. Sweden is a market that is right now the size of the French residential solar market. So something's wrong in that equation, and it's not the size of Sweden. It's France going to 10x, right? And I think the inherent logic of solar is super, super strong. If you can beat the grid price, if you can beat the wholesale power price, you can this makes sense. Developers of property will see this increasingly, whether it's residential property or commercial property. The utility players are going to add utility scale solar even in the Nordics. And it's so fast. I mean, you don't see it coming. But if there's a rationale, as Harald said, well, solar gets built out in a matter of weeks and months in the commercial sector, utility sector. And for households, it can be a matter of days, right? We see demand coming up when there's a front story news about price hikes or big price changes. Aftonbladet and VG, they drive demand when they talk about power prices. Right?
You talked about Poland, but isn't also, I was surprised to hear that the Netherlands had showed a big increase in solar, and that's also not known for its space. But you both mentioned sort of growth areas and views to expand elsewhere outside the Nordics. Could you talk a little bit about what your plans are, Andreas?
Yeah, so we started in Norway in 2016, went to Sweden in 2018. We acquired a French solar portal called In Sun We Trust in 2019 and entered Spain organically by the end of 2019. So we've been there about a year. We entered Poland last month, and we're going into Italy now in February. So our tactic is to enter the large European countries to gain market share in those and expand our gross margin and take each country to profit within 3 years. That's the method. And if you look at our European map, there are a few large European countries missing. I'd love to add them in the coming years.
Do you work with retailers, power retailers, or do your customers are mainly off-grid here, or what's the situation?
We're entirely on-grid, existing housing, standard panels, very, very standardized. The way Otovo works is that we sell solar panels online to consumers. Our software calculates the optimal project on their roof and then finds one of the available installers in the area and conducts an auction between the installers we have on our platform to do that project in real time. So if you go to otovo.se or .es or wherever you may live, you input your address, you will get a quote that is live and committed from us and our installers immediately. On the back end of that, we have about 300 installer companies that provide the service and price their labor, driving costs, scaffolding, everything that goes into a project. We're a marketplace for energy installations. That's how it works. We put it up on people's roofs behind the meter, and they own the energy from there on and do with it whatever they choose. And to us, the electricity grid and the electric retailers, they're part of an ecosystem that we live side by side with them.
But certainly some kind of disruption there as well into traditional ways of doing things. But for you guys, Alight, where are your plans for growth and expansion?
I think very similar to what Andreas is saying, that we just look at the map and figure out where things are happening, where there's a strong and clear long-term demand, and also from the regulatory side, where you can see that it's apparent that you can deploy solar and power purchase agreements at this today without trouble. And for us, we have the team on the ground in Spain and then in Poland. Indeed, so Poland for us is a very important market. Just as Andreas is saying, it's come from basically nowhere, and it's accelerating very rapidly. And the first large-scale power purchase agreement with a commercial customer was signed in Poland actually just 4 weeks ago. Not by us, but by a German company called BioRe, which signed with Heidelberg Cement. But I think that's just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, there's so much going on now in the market. So, and then in addition to Poland and Spain, places like Germany and Netherlands that you mentioned are becoming very important. And I think what's happened in those markets is that they have a long history of deploying solar on the back of very strict incentive regimes. So a very kind of artificial market, if you like. But that's now changed very rapidly. So in Germany now you can actually deploy unsubsidized solar, PPA-backed solar. And then, of course, the maturity of the market is there because people are used to seeing solar. So it's a really interesting switch in those markets that we want to be a part of, and we want to lead that. I mean, we see ourselves as kind of the second wave of solar in Europe. So it's like the first wave was very much about capturing incentives and just deploying according to what governments were asking for. Now the second wave is to build out organically a market-based solar that's just based on the idea that if you can create value for a customer, then you can build solar. That's it.
We see in Poland and Spain especially, you have a lot of very large-scale renewable tenders and auctions. How do they coexist with the PPA market?
Yes, that is a good question. And in Poland, especially now, that's exactly what's happening. There are auctions coming at certain intervals, and in between, you want to do the PPA sort of transactions. And I mean, they're coexisting in a peaceful manner, I would say. But of course, it's up to you as someone who's deploying in the market. If you have access to a particular site, you have to figure out if you think that you're going to have the best return on your investment if you put it into the auction or not. But I mean, that's the auctions ultimately most likely will, if not go away, they will at least become somewhat secondary to the PPA market. So yeah, it's not something that's disturbing. What was difficult before was the feed-in tariff regimes, the FIT regimes, because typically they basically prohibited other deployment of solar. So in Germany, you couldn't do solar if you didn't do it in the FIT regime. The auctions is not like that. I mean, the auctions is just essentially it's just the government buying a PPA from you. So fine. I mean, for us, it works well.
I'd just like to close on one final question, and this would be maybe on a wish list for the Green Deal recovery post-COVID. What would be your number one wish list for sort of the regulators in Brussels, Harald?
It's definitely about evening out the regulatory framework across Europe, just leveling the playing field and making sure. And this is something that the European Commission has explicitly asked member states to do. So they've asked them to level the playing field for power purchase agreements and make unsubsidized commercial solar efficient and just something that's clear, something that works just as well as the old regime. I think that's on its. Certainly, no one in particular is against it, but I would like to see if we could see some money invested in making that happen. Then that would help the market, because at the moment it's a bit of a puzzle with regional and national legislations.
For you, Andreas, what would be top of your list?
We like what the EU has done already with being pro-consumer and pro-third-party ownership in the residential sector. So very thankful for the pretty level playing field that has been created between the prosumers on the one side and the energy incumbents on the other. So a good start to that. I think where we want to go now is to reduce the permitting load for residential solar. The EU could do well in copying Poland, saying that anything below a certain threshold, for example, 6 or 9 kilowatt, can be installed on the grid without any permitting. That would speed things up and lead to a faster deployment without much risk to the grid. I think the permit acceptance levels are at 99% in most grids because the players know what they're doing. So you could do sort of a after the fact documentation rather than before the fact permitting. That would accelerate the market, and it would bring the market forward by at least a quarter.
That's a refreshing view and not one you hear very often. The EU should learn from Poland. But guys, thank you very much for an excellent discussion and all your insights into a very dynamic and fast-growing sector.
Thank you, Richard, for having us. It was wonderful. Thank you.
So listeners, you can now follow the podcast on our own Twitter account, aptly named the Montel Weekly Podcast. Please direct message any suggestions, questions, or let us know if you think you have a good idea for a guest on the show. You can also send us an email to podcast@montelnews.com. Lastly, remember to keep up to date with all that's happening in energy markets on Montel News. You can subscribe on Apple Podcasts and Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts from. Thank you and goodbye.